There we go.
Yeah, we're on now.
Doing
So,
it live.
welcome. Yes, welcome. It's Frank, Cory, and Kate um, on our new podcast in like what, 1 year?
Yeah, it's been a minute. Like the last time we were talking, the invasion had only been about a year old in Ukraine, and uh, things are kind of going, wishy-washy one way and the other. So,
Yeah, indeed. Um, and since then, like things have first they kind of stagnated, and then they just went completely crazy and off the rails,
yeah.
which is really fascinating. So yeah, we have a lot of things we would like to talk in this podcast, if not today, in future installments. So feel free to listen, to put in your background, and hopefully learn something. Um, so on that note, where will we start then? I know you have
Uh,
other topics you want to cover, Corey.
Actually, yeah, I was keeping track of kind of what's been going on in Ukraine with their counterattack on Russia, and they've actually been involving some of the warfare further into the 21st century. Uh, like we already know the use of drones for like anti-infantry sort of movements, and then looking at different trenches, using them as scouts, and then even just anti-tank weapons. But I watched recently. There's a channel on YouTube that shares some of the leaked videos from some of the drone footage, and they've
Yeah,
been using them successfully against attack helicopters now, where
indeed.
they've been ramming like tail rotors and stuff and taking them out and then bringing these like Russian attack helicopters down, the Mi-28, the Mi-24 even. I was like, man, you could take down an alligator, the hind with like what, a $200 drone.
Yeah,
That's pretty badass, man. But that's the future. I mean, uh I played a game recently, the Ghost Recon, the most recent one that came out, and they introduce a lot of drones into that, which I found really annoying because I was very traditionalist. Like I like open field battles, like Cold War era sort of, back and forth for gaming sort of thing. But this is really where warfare is going now. It's the jet aircraft. What the jet aircraft was to the 20th century is now in the 21st century is drones, where it just
yeah.
adds this whole new element that how do you address it?
I actually read a few articles about that, where it is even theorized that the drone is essentially taking the place of the combat helicopter. And I can see that, like, the fast reaction and reconnaissance element of modern armies that reacts quickly and offers the abilities that you just talked about in a way that is much cheaper, even if analog to the combat helicopter. I don't think the combat helicopter will be completely replaced by the drone, but they will see the role diminished to probably some sort of flying cavalry element like they were in the start.
No, yeah, and like the Apache helicopter, you can IR something and then it'll be essentially like flying artillery. You can put a
Yeah,
Hellfire missile, something 2 miles away from where you're launching it, so you can hide behind a hill, pop up, shoot, pop back down, get away.
yeah,
But you can't carry an attack helicopter in a backpack, and you can definitely carry at least a couple drones and even just one backpack and loaded with explosives. I mean, we've seen the Russian tanks, like the turtle tanks they've been coming out with that look very World
yeah,
War One ish, uh, where you're removing the ability to move a turret. Um,
yeah.
and so it kind of made me think of like World War II, like some of the German
Yeah, like the
anti-tank.
Stoic.
Yeah, the Stuckpanzer, where it's like you can't even move the turret. There is no turret to move. It's just a
Yeah,
mobile gun you turn back and forth. And I was like, they're going back to that essentially in the 21st century. Um,
yeah,
but
and essentially it seems that they're not even that effective. They're just um, losing advantages
yeah,
for
there's
what is really a hodgepodge type of armor that drones can avoid easily, that you
it's
can see in
very
the current
redneck.
form.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well,
yeah, yes. What you were saying?
oh, and I was just gonna say, it's interesting to see like all the backwards evolution of things, like trying to figure out, well, how do we stop these things now? We're gonna go back to using old technologies, hanging chains and stuff like we used to do for torpedoes off of ships.
Yeah.
Um, and then on top of that, it's also interesting just looking, kind of jumping topics a little bit, but still related, is going into this uh, Ukraine being on the defensive for so long and then now bringing the fight to Russia. It's going to make them readdress their fronts and uh, it's going to make them divert forces because you can't just let them invade your country after you've invaded theirs. And so they're going to have to maneuver a little bit, which is
That's
genius on.
illegal.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Well, we can invade you. You can't do it to us. This isn't right. But I see Putin in the same light. He's like the high school bully that'll walk over and punch you in the head, but then whenever you punch him back, he'll cry and say you're, being mean. It's like, are you fucking serious, dude? Like
Yeah.
you have to be able to realize like war does not work in one direction. You walk up and punch somebody, they're probably going to punch you back. Um,
Yeah, and nothing to talk about that. Just make a quick recap. So, those who are listening to us are probably aware of this, but in February 2022, the Russian Federation invades Ukraine. It was a large-scale invasion. Not the first time they did that. The 2014 intervention, the supposedly uh, separatists from Donetsk and Luhansk, by all accounts, were Russian troops infiltrated, and then they took over Crimea with the same kind of strategy. That war stood still for 8 years, and then came the large-scale invasion. And it has been like a real David versus Goliath struggle from Ukraine to try to survive the Russian onslaught. And for 2 years and a half, the Russians have been throwing themselves at Ukrainian defenses, and some accounts say that half a million soldiers died for Russia to try to break this defense. And it has had a lot of back and forth. In 2023, actually going back in 2022, Ukraine managed to reclaim two large pieces of land in Kharkiv and Kherson. Then it stagnated again in middle 2023 uh, because of international pressure. For the most part, at least that's how I see it, and an attempt from the General Zaluzny to try to show some work. They made an offensive, summer offensive in the Zaporizhia region in the south that, despite everything, was a failure in the end. And things weren't looking really good for Ukraine since then, with the loss of what's the name of Bakhmut, with the loss of Avdiivka. Despite the atrocious Russian losses, they were actually put on the back foot. I heard a video from Ed Nash, who was also a good military historian, and he said that Ukraine, despite all the Western support, it's not enough. But despite all of it, it was really risking losing the war. And what do you do when you are losing a game, right? You change the game. That's what he said. He changed the game, and that's what he did in 6 August 2024. Like at this point, 7 days ago, no, 5 days ago, they changed the game and invaded Russia themselves, and with extreme success. Like in 5 days, they reclaimed more land than Russia did in 6 months, which is insane when you think about it, right? Um,
well, yeah, I was gonna say it's also just like it took long enough to be able to jump back against them. Like there's so much corruption within the Ukrainian military. Even
yeah,
it's just kind of a Eastern European thing, where Zelensky is a great leader, and I think he did a good thing to change up his command. I feel like they have good capability for a lot of their special forces. as well as like some of their top level people. But just whenever you get into the mid level and below that, whenever you have any kind of corruption, it just kind of throws a wrench in your ability to fight a war. And
Yeah,
it's kind of inspiring to see that now they're on the counteroffensive, and instead of just taking one town, now they're bringing the fight to Russia to be like, hey, man, if you're going to hit us, we're going to hit right back.
yeah,
And I feel like with Western support, like you were talking about, NATO and, all the rest of us that are trying to support them. Our politicians are on the fence as far as like, are we actually going to get involved? And
mhm,
the answer is like all across the board no, but I think that's just because they're afraid of Putin's nuclear weapons. Otherwise I'm sure they'd be in there hammering it like Vietnam. Like, here, you want more
yeah.
troops? Cool. Um,
I
but
think sorry for interrupting you, but I think the issue of the nuclear weapons, I never thought it was really the main issue. Because when you look back, and even today, you see that a lot of European, especially European, but also some American politicians and entrepreneurs, businessmen, whatever, they have a lot of money invested in Russia. And I think even now, some people have the hope that they may still normalize relations and recover the money they've lost thus far.
right.
Like like as there is corruption on the lower levels of the Ukrainian military, and they've been trying to do a lot of work to try to resolve the situation. There's a lot of corruption in politics in general, as it always has. But the corruption of, especially the European politicians and their seduction by the Russian oligarchs, especially because of all the cheap oil and natural gas that allow them um, enormous gains in terms of money, resales and whatever. Actually, Angela Merkel even spoke about that she regretted all the investments she did in Russia. But at the time, it gave her a lot of money.
Yeah, well, and that's why Germany was kind of harangued on a lot of that too, because they wanted to pull away from Russia as soon as the invasion started and be able to say, we're not okay with this. But then at the same time, they were very much reliant on Russian natural gas. They had a lot of that pipeline going to Europe, and it was just one of those things that it's like, well, they felt like they were cutting off a foot if they then, put the boot on Russia.
Yeah,
Uh, but uh, that's where it's a questionable thing too. Like, if you have a friend, like not even a best friend, but a friend who's suddenly stealing from your other friends, like they steal your friend's car or they burn their house down or something, like you can't really say that they're a friend then now. Uh,
yeah,
and if you do, I mean, what does that say about you? It's like, well, we're best friends, but I like Jimmy, and even though he burned your car in your driveway, he's a cool dude. No, you have to be like, hey, Jimmy, that wasn't okay. Uh, you know, but
yeah,
then, being reliant on it's like, then if they're your carpool ride to work, it's like, well, now I know that they're a psycho and maybe I don't want to ride with them anyway, but now I have to figure things out on my own. So,
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because at the time, I think it was by the end of 2022, Peter Zion made um, a podcast about that, and where he said that now, like Germany has just a couple years, Germany as an example, but other European countries too, just have a couple years to really move away from Russian gas and remake all of their infrastructure to accept liquefied gas from the United States, which is also something. One of the reasons that one of the things that I really have an issue understanding. I mean, I have an issue understanding rationally from the emotional standpoint. I know why some Americans do not want to support Ukraine, but these open so many opportunities to American businesses that it's just crazy. And the idea that you just like America can replace Russia as a purveyor of natural gas, Like there's so many opportunities here that when I see like people trying to rationalize why America should be involved in Ukraine in any way, I know that some of them do have the same issue that the European politicians. They have money involved in Russia, but there's so much more money to be made by replacing Russia in what they've been doing thus far.
Well, and that's what always trips me up too, is we have this mindset as Americans throughout history. If you really look at um, a lot of the wars we've been involved in, you look at World War One, you look at World War Two, the United States was very, very slow to even get involved.
Yeah,
And especially World War Two, there were a lot of interviews done even on camera. Like, well, what do you think about the war in Europe? With Germany conquering nations around them, and almost unanimously the response had been, well, that's a European problem. That's not us. We should stay out of it. Uh,
yeah,
Except the only reason America did so well in the 1950s and onwards, we had this like golden age in America where everybody owned a house and a car and everything else is because of our involvement in World War II. And
yeah,
it's like at some point we got sucker punched and got kind of dragged into it anyway. But there was Pearl Harbor, and then immediately after Pearl Harbor happened, Germany declared war on us, and we decided, well, we're going to fight this two-front war now since it's not right at our back door, literally. Uh, and so supporting England and doing the Lend-Lease and all that, that's actually what drove our economy for so many years, is just this debt that Europe accounted for. We'd produce these weapons, ship them to Europe, but that always came with a receipt, to be like, well, you're going to pay us back for that later on.
yeah,
Uh, and so Americans forget, like, we didn't just magically become this, wealthy country that just had money, coming out of our ears out of nothing. It was all from supporting these countries through war. Fast forward to modern day, like your point on natural gas, liquefied gas, for the European market, there's that angle. It's like Russia's a competitor. I mean,
yeah.
eh, as far as resources go, it wouldn't be that much harder for the United States to send a lot of the same sort of resources to Europe as it does for Russia. Um, but what's fascinating too is that people don't seem to connect that more important than even natural resources like gas and oil are food. And Ukraine is one of the world suppliers of things like wheat and I think barley. They had all this agriculture. It's like 99% of their exports. And this war is, hung that up really badly, and they had all this excess stock that they couldn't get rid of. I know Poland, uh, a lot of the Polish government and Polish people had been kind of angry because they were taking in Ukrainian grain at like a reduction, and then that hurt the Polish market for their agriculture. Um, but there wasn't that avenue for where all these places would be buying Ukrainian wheat and relying on their agriculture. They couldn't do that because there's a war going on.
Mhm.
And I don't think people realize too the impact that'll have years from now, decades from now, even just the catch up to having that food supply impeded. So
Yeah. Again, it's we start talking about the Kursk offensive, but it is interesting because again, in going back to Zion and his opinions about the United States, he even stated that with two of the most important cereal exporters in the world being at war and essentially in the deadlock where they're destroying each other, what is happening, America can even increase its production of cereal and essentially replace them. The market is open. Which again, there's a lot of advantages of getting involved in this.
right.
So there's that. There's also the. I think some people do ignore the ideological aspect on political conversation because they believe with some reason, with some it makes some sense, but it's not. complete sense. They assume that all politics is based on logical stuff, like I believe in this religion because I will not pay taxes, so that's why I'm signing this religion, or stuff like that. But sometimes there is an ideological aspect on this, and for I do believe that some people do think that is either immoral or goes against the, whatever they stand by siding with the side in a war, right? Especially a war that is so far away from America. When like I see some people talking about that, there's also another aspect where some people might get annoyed, which is like the remnants of Soviet propaganda in the academical space, which is something I dealt with when I was at college, even in Portugal. Um, whether people truly believe that everything America and the West is doing is evil, and so they kind of battle to keep America out of this stuff because they do want Russia to win because they believe Russia is the moral superior. And those people also kind of come forth to muddle the discussion about aid to Ukraine. And not only that's also the Palestinian situation, which we must probably save for a bit later before things get all mixed up.
Right.
But that's interesting. And so just to finish this aside, um, and I've been thinking a lot about this because I know a lot of activists because of my times in university and because of some other people I met later on. People do believe like all the woke stuff, all the equal rights stuff, feminists, whatever, and those people are coming forth to truly support Russia, which I think it's completely mind-boggling because Russia truly is everything they hate. It embodies everything they hate. Even the Russian propaganda describes the West as some sort of gay, demonic monsters that need to be destroyed. They have laws against homosexuals, against women's rights right now. Even Putin has said that the duty of a good woman is to have children, and it kind of boggles my mind of how the so-called leftists have this like present this support towards groups like Russia and Hamas, for example, who are a complete antithesis of all they believe in.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting too, where there are so many factions within ideologies that have been fractured. Because
Yeah.
traditional leftists were and are, like very accepting of pretty much everybody. But there are some that are like on the fringe, like you said, that it's like, why would you support, something that like Russia in general, like threw people in prison for going to a lesbian band
Hmm.
performance,
Yes.
that band Pussy Riot. You just attended that and they could arrest you for it because they were like, well, it promotes lesbianism, etc. And it just there's this disconnect where I think people not necessarily want to get on a bandwagon, but they just decide, what side they're on any given topic, and they don't even really do their research. Um,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's an American problem more than anywhere else, but it exists in other places as well, of
Yes.
course. I can see it in Europe as well. Like they had a fascist rally in Italy fairly recently, and there were Italians that were very upset about that, where they were like, "Are you serious? Like we
Yeah.
we went through this before, and that didn't exactly go very well." Um, And then Germany has been doing it the right way. I feel like they've had some very far right people get together, but they've been shutting that down pretty well. Like, no, we're not doing this again. Uh,
Didn't go well for us.
no, and they're at least more serious about it. Where, uh, unfortunately, the United States does not have that same sort of uh, cutoff. Where it's a lot more complicated as to how, with free speech, freedom of gathering, how exactly do you separate hate speech or a hostile political movement from just people gathering and speaking their mind? Whereas, like in Europe, again, like in Germany, if I grabbed a swastika flag and walked down the street, I guarantee I would end up in prison. Uh,
Yeah.
it's like there's this delineation line, but even then, they have some groups in Germany that like to skirt it. There's an illegal motorcycle gang in Germany that is definitely neo-Nazi. Uh, and they're not really ashamed of it, but at the same time, when the government asks, what are you doing? They have these clever ways of kind of obscuring it and trying to say, oh, well, no, that's not really what we're doing. Um,
Exactly.
where they'll even have like, I don't know if you're familiar, but in the United States at least, especially, and probably elsewhere, the German alphabet and the English alphabet are identical.
Yeah.
So there's a tattoo that neo-Nazis will always get that is 88, and it's because H is the eighth letter in the alphabet. So you have 88, and it's essentially Heil Hitler in a
Huh.
tattoo without being outward and loud about it, without being a swastika. Um, little things like that, or like the skinhead movement, as far as the racist skinheads, because there is actually a fascinating group in the United States that's like skinheads against racists, and they're pretty cool. Um, but the skinheads, in the sense of like Nazis, have little tells that will tell you who they are, and they're identifiable immediately. Their boots are the number one thing. They favor things like Doc Martens, and they'll put their laces on them in a particular way where they're in a stepladder pattern going up the boot. And if they're white on a black boot, that's a good sign that they're a racist, like white supremacist skinhead. If
Mhm.
they're red, it means they've spilled blood for it. So it's one of those things that's like just these subtle little signs that can kind of go under the radar for most people. Like most people wouldn't know that. Um, but then you find that and it's like, oh, I know exactly who this guy is now. um,
Yeah.
so just little things, but yeah, it's all over the place. It's just strange to me where people will find their bandwagon, and I feel like their intentions in the right place, where maybe they feel like they're picking up a cause that hasn't been heard before, or they feel like they're getting in on something that is maybe targeted, for lack of a better word. Like the way I would see like any of the leftists who are supporting Russia, I don't see them looking at it as like, oh well, I love Russia so much, as much as I see them looking at it and going, well, all these other countries are against Russia, and all of them are so in support of Ukraine, but who's supporting Russia? And so, maybe they need support, and and I was like, nah. So I think
Yeah. Not only that. You can go on. Go on. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, you're fine. I was just gonna say, like, I think their heart may be coming from, a more benign place, but they don't realize that they're supporting the villain,
Yeah.
essentially. Where I'm not against the Russian people, and I'm in full support of Russia in the sense of their people, because I feel like they've been victimized by a dictator who is literally throwing them into a meat grinder, and obviously he doesn't give a damn about their well-being. So I don't fault the Russian people so much as their leadership, on this. But what they need to realize too is it's entirely a different story, where Russians overall, in the civilian perspective, have been safe. They can still go to the store. They can still, do their day-to-day thing. And although their economy sucks because we've tanked it with
Yeah.
sanctions, they still live their normal every day-to-day lives. But in Ukraine, It's very different where normal families have had their entire apartment blocks leveled. They've had their schools destroyed. They've had their hospitals destroyed. They had um, the Associated Press. I watched their progression going through and reporting in Ukraine, and the reporters themselves were so horrified that they went to a hospital, which is normally off grounds for warfare. You don't hit hospitals, you don't hit schools, and it was bombed actively while they were there. And they watched live on TV, almost just recording this moment real time, where they had a maternity ward, these pregnant women who were bombed essentially as part of the hospital hit. And as they're dragging them out, this woman, obviously pregnant, obviously expecting very soon, lost her child immediately from, I think it was shrapnel wounds or something else or another, and then she died later on. And it's like this disconnect that's like it's entirely different. Like, yes, I feel bad for the Russian people, but I feel much worse for the Ukrainians because they're getting the boot heel, and we're watching this country essentially curb stomp somebody, and all of us are just kind of putting our thumbs up and going, well, good luck. you know
Yeah,
so
here, have one bullet. Now go at them.
yeah, here's a little pistol, good luck. Where I understand politically, and internationally for diplomatic reasons why we can't get involved, especially as NATO, uh, directly. But at the same time, like, I don't understand this disconnect that people have where they're like, oh, well, they shouldn't be begging us for stuff. It's like they're not even begging. Zelensky actually had a brilliant thing that he talked about that I was like, this man is amazing. Zelensky is
Yeah,
one of my heroes. Where he pointed out, he's like, any of the Americans that are against the war in Ukraine, like anytime they send, say we're sending $2 billion in aid, he made the point that most of my own countrymen don't even realize is they're not sending them money. They're not writing them a check and saying, here's $2 billion, blow it on whatever you want. We're sending them materials. It's
yeah,
those things that Ukraine will be paying for in the future, and the manufacture of those things is supporting American jobs to like make the
yeah,
munitions, make the equipment, and then send it over. And Zelensky himself pointed that out, and I was like, most of my countrymen don't even know that because they've all got their heads buried in the sand, or they're too worried about politics here to even bother about anywhere else in the world.
yeah.
So, uh,
Um, yeah, talking about that. Um, I had a point, but it kind of scared me regarding the sending of those materials, because that's something that the Russian propaganda does, like, and it has been targeting Americans specifically. Because not that the Europeans are not being targeted, they're being targeted in different ways, but in that aspect, they've been targeting Americans specifically with propaganda that even says where is the money going, and and even like memes showing Zelensky accepting money and then thanking American politicians. But this brings me to another point, and going back to the main topic of the Kursk incursion, where all the Ukrainians are completely silent about what they're doing. They admitted already that they are attacking Russia. They admitted that there are goals that are trying to achieve, but that's basically what they've said. Like some soldiers have have been giving some tidbits that they are capturing a lot of prisoners. And I want to know your opinion about that because that's interesting. Um, but what I find interesting and goes with what you're saying is most uh, because the only people that are talking about the incursion really are the Russian government and the Russian media space. Like the Ukrainians are really silent. The media space is in complete panic. It's still in complete panic. I have some windows open in Chrome, like looking at Twitter and some of the people I've been talking with, and it just like they're just sharing these posts about complete panic among the Russian people, like what's going on. The Ukrainians are already here. Some people even say that they saw Ukrainian soldiers near Kursk itself, which is insane. And I don't know if even believe that. The Russian government, though, has been said that they are managed to stop the attack. They're starting to repel the attack. There's everything is okay. No need to panic. In the meanwhile, two air bases have been completely pulverized, but no need for panic. The several Western media outlets, though, have been saying constantly for the last 5 days what the Russians are saying. Like the Ukrainian attack was stopped, the Russians are defending, and it's done for. Like the Ukrainian attack is done for. And like even the New York Times published something about this, and I know some people in the military, in the Portuguese military I talked with, who even showed me those pictures. Like, look, the newspapers are saying that the Ukrainian strike was stopped, and then in the very next hour, I know of two or three more towns that were captured by the Ukrainians. So there's this strange, like in the media, I think there's a strange bias, like this idea that Ukraine cannot win. There are also, of course, the influence from TASS and Russia Today that are and the other outlets that they kind of read from each other. They take information from each other, although they are controlled by the Russian government. And but that's the way this information is being offered, which we that are inform ourselves through different media uh, know that it's fake, but it's still put out there, and it really messes with people's opinions on things. And it's something that I'm really trying to understand on that point. Like I know
Well,
that newspapers want to confirm information before saying it, but I truly believe that they have access to the same, at least some of the same sources that I have, so they could at least be more ambiguous about what they're saying.
right. Well, and then the 21st century is compounded too with social media, where it's no longer even just newspapers or recognized news outlets that are giving information, and there's always been an issue with sometimes bias or direct influence on that. Look at World War II.
Hmm.
What I see Russia doing is the same as what Nazi Germany did when they invaded Poland. They had some of their own guys go across the border and shoot at a German outpost. And so
Hmm.
anybody in the area could legitimately say that they, saw and heard that there was an attack on this German outpost. And so they used that as justification to then invade Poland. And then, of course, controlling the media, they were like, "Oh yeah, this hellacious attack against Germany from Poland," and anybody on the Polish side would have been like, "Hey, wait a minute, that never happened." Uh,
Yeah,
but anybody on the border would have been like, "No, I saw that happen totally." And it's like the misinformation even then, but now it's compounded with you'll have, um, maybe not so much in the Ukraine war, but for anything else like politics here, you'll have an influencer. Somebody I dislike strongly is someone like Joe Rogan, where yeah, he's got his own podcast, he does his own thing, and that's fine. It's free speech. He can do his own show however he wants. But
mhm.
I feel like because he has such a following, any guest he has automatically has this clout that, well, now they're on the Joe Rogan show. Now they're a reliable source of information.
Yeah,
And they are definitely not. I mean, you get the likes of like Elon Musk and, somebody who draws, a 3-year-old drawing of a car and now it's the hottest, weird, not even a truck out there. And I'm like, the stupidity is just amazing. But it's from influence. And then he'll have other people on too. Like they seem like an expert in something, but they're not. But because they're on his show, now anybody watching is going to listen and be like, "Oh, well, they know what they're talking about. They're on this show. Obviously, they've been vetted, and yada yada." And it's like that's not even that's not even what's happening. Um, But it's terrifying too that people can be so misled. That patch that I really love, the term vatnik, came up from Russian resistance, where they were like, a vatnik is somebody who believes the whole Russian state media, Putin version of everything and doesn't even question. And so now they have a term, they are a vatnik. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's confusing. It's a confusing mess sometimes.
It is, and even in the United States, the whole idea, kind of divulging. So, I mean, stop me if you want me to go into that sort of topic later on. Uh, but it's sort of like the Trump cult here, the
Yeah, I
MAGA,
mean,
the MAGA
we
cult.
we can go there like in 15 minutes or so because I really want to make you another question
Yeah.
before you move to America. Let's just finish the kerfuffle, um, which is like as again we already talked this. It is a shock, it's a sucker punch. Like Ukrainians seem to be heading for the defeat, and then this have happened. One thing that has characterized this war is how deadly it is and how each side is having like really a lot of trouble capturing prisoners. It's always in small numbers, except in like large events, like in the fall of Azovstal in the beginning of the war. But apparently, since the incursion into Kursk started, especially the Russian conscripts, haven't just surrendering in mass. Apparently, there are so many prisoners, which are at least 1,000, but probably are way more than that, that that the Ukrainian logistics is being stressed by the amount of people they need to move back into Ukraine. And I really, you know, Soviet mindset and Russian mindset way better than I do, and I really like to know what you think about this because I've been finding this fascinating. Like there was almost no prisoners, and suddenly there are so many prisoners. One of the factions doesn't know what to do with them.
Well, and that's the other thing that makes it so different, uh, about just this war. Anyways, the logistics of how anything works in it. Um, there's no infrastructure for an actual war. I think because it happened so rapidly and because both sides were unprepared, um, it just kerfuffles a lot of that. And then now that they're invading Kursk, it's like they had like the border guards surrender, and so your point brings up like where are they going to put them?
Yeah,
But
because
that was
the
kind of
idea that
inspiring too to see that they actually gave up. Like the border guards have always been like one of, at least during the Soviet era, they were a very proud organization to be a part of. You
yeah,
were the border guards. They were like elite guys, and then they gave up without a fight. So it's like that's a sign this is no longer the Russia they think they are. So
yeah. Yeah, I find that really fascinating. One of the things that I've heard about it is that because most of these border guards are really, they are not the trained soldiers you're talking about, they are conscripts. Because most of the trained soldiers are sunk deep in Ukraine, literally and figuratively. Um, and so they are being replacing all of them with conscripts because there's a system of conscription that opens every year in Russia, and they are using these young kids that really don't even have training because all the training is going to the guys that are going to Ukraine, and they're just placing them in half-made trenches and like you don't need like they won't attack us, so just sit there and look pretty. And suddenly they are being overrun by guys with really heavy equipment going around them, and I mean they're probably just terrified.
right, they're like, wait a minute, this isn't what we signed up for.
Yeah,
And I
there's
mean,
another.
to be honest, I doubt they expected it. And so, I mean, if I was conscripted in the Russian army and assigned to border guards, I'd be like, phew, at least I don't have to go into Ukraine. And if they roll up with
Yeah.
tanks and helicopters, I'd be like, well, shit.
Yeah.
Here's my rifle, man. I'm cool. Like, what do my guys even expect me to do about this at this point?
Yeah. And like another interesting point is that according to the current military regime, you only get your extra payments if you are injured or killed, only goes to your family if it is proved that you were killed in Ukraine. So this is really cool for the Russians because they don't even recover most of the bodies. So they can say, oh, 500,000 deaths? No, just 10,000 deaths and 400,000 missing action. So they
Yeah,
don't need to pay any of them. But that also means that if those conscripts are injured or killed by the Ukrainians in Russia, they don't they don't receive anything. It's ironic. Like if you die to defend the motherland, you don't get anything. Your family doesn't get anything, which is really fascinating. So even if they weren't scared shitless, what is the motivation to fight?
exactly. Yeah, well, and there was an interview done with a Russian where they did it kind of sneakily in Russia to talk to him, and he had fought in Ukraine. He was injured, like they injured his hip in an explosion,
Hmm.
I think, from an artillery round. And when he went back to the hospital, they gave him like very basic level care. Like he didn't even get advanced analgesics.
Shit.
Um, and as a Russian soldier, like he was like, I'm done. Like I don't want to go back. And he's like, they're gonna force me to go back anyway, and I know it. But
Hmm.
he was talking about that. Like for a lot of them, there's no way out of it. Where he got sent home for an injury, and they're not even discharging him permanently because he's disabled now. Essentially, like he can barely walk, and uh, he was so angry about that. He was like, I'm planning on, maybe even I'll just shoot myself before they send me back because there's no other
Yeah,
option. And it's like understanding the little bit of Russian I do, following along. It wasn't like a journalistic dig or like, anybody manipulating the story to be like, oh, well, this is totally, it's legitimately what the Russians are going through. And so it kind of makes me
and
wonder too, like with this push into Kursk, uh, I feel like they're going to be panic mode in Putin's regime now because they already had I wouldn't even call it a coup attempt, like when the mercenaries stood up to them because it lasted
yeah,
for like
Prigozhin. Yeah,
yeah, it lasted for less than 24 hours, and then we already know he was going to be executed. Like, what a coward. Like, you're going to throw a coup, and then because they tell you to stop, he's like, yeah, okay. It's like, they're going to
yeah,
kill you anyway. Just keep going, dude. Like,
and he was killed. So
yeah. And it's like, we didn't see that coming. you know?
I was
Uh,
actually shocked that he lived for so long afterwards.
well, I was too. I thought he'd fall out of a Moscow hotel window, like most of the other people. It's like,
And you're talking about panic mode. It's interesting because there's just Russian troops from everywhere they can find them, even from Kharkiv. Apparently, the Kharkiv salient, they are going to pull back from it. They're just going to give up on that offensive after like losing 5,000, 50,000 killed in that operation alone. They're just moving all the troops they can to Kursk by daylight in convoys. And apparently, one of the occasions, like the Ukrainians fired ATACMS missiles with shrapnel warheads, they kill like 500 people in a single go because they're just clustered together in trucks.
See, that's the weird thing to me too, is like this entire war. We talked about that before, on one of the previous like podcast episodes. Is I studied a lot of like Soviet military doctrine, and usually, after World War II, especially, they were like, we have to learn to do our shit right.
Yeah,
So they had really good, ground plans for how you would perform an invasion and how your support forces and everything else would be in place. But ever since the fall of the USSR, it was like we had that, it's not even 10 years. That's like 20, 30 years after that. It got so corrupt and they stopped even bothering really training anybody. Uh,
yeah,
they didn't have any of the officers for like retention it was more like, military officer rank was you got that because you had a buddy in the military or, a political person that liked you. And so they were like, here, you're a general now. Uh, and because of that, though, you can see like they are not equipped to fight a conventional war. Like, they had some gains in ground because they can force people to do things, and humans are humans. I mean, even with nothing, we'll figure something out, which is how they had some of their success. But, I mean, at this point, like you pointed out, pulling people back in a convoy, not even having been military myself, I'm like, you know, maybe not the best idea because
No,
uh, if you fought a conventional army, like, if they fought NATO, that'd be like one A-10 would wipe out your convoy, and then, well, now what? So
exactly. I mean, have you seen the pictures of the convoys?
I haven't seen a
Like
lot of them.
it's like it's mind-boggling. Like they're just sending one after the other, and just being obliterated by artillery or drones. It also I find interesting that you talked about the Soviet doctrine, because I've also followed Tom Cooper, and one of the things that he said on his latest update is that the Ukrainians are fighting as Soviets, while the Russians are just a World War One mob, not even that. And they said like all the things that the Ukrainians are doing is actually the Soviet doctrine with drones on top of it. So they have the
Right.
drones like up to 20, 30 kilometers ahead of the main of any troops that they have on the field. Then they have the sabotage groups that go ahead and just cause absolute mayhem. And then they have these small groups of heavily armed units that just finish whatever the sabotage groups start. And that's how they've been able to capture so many population centers in so little time. They don't even bother with fortification or trenches. They just go around them and strike where it truly matters.
Well,
And
that's the funny thing too. Is like you said, going into Kursk, it's like they've taken the traditional, Russian Soviet doctrine and
Mhm.
turned it right around to use against them, and they're totally unprepared for it.
Yeah,
It makes no sense that they would forget their own. They wrote the book, and then they
yeah.
just threw the book away because it wasn't making money. I guess it's one of those things. It's like,
It's
how does
not
this
just
happen
making
to you?
money. It's not the way the system Putin works. Like it's not a it's about money, of course, but above all, it's about loyalty, especially loyalty towards Putin himself. So he may be the best general in the world, but that's a problem because because you're the best general in the world, you have all the tools to topple over Putin. So it don't it must go away. And
Ex-
the the stupid asshole that is 100% loyal, that guy is going to your place.
yep. Well, and then what's incompetence?
Exactly. And it
Uh,
just cost half a million soldiers.
and that's the thing that always topples dictatorships, and that's what I'm curious for the next steps to see is how are the Russians going to tolerate this now? Like, I feel like all the way along, Russia's always had the problem of people are so used to hardship and so used to just things not going well anyway that they don't even so much like smile and nod, but
Mhm.
they will at least just shrug and say, well, that's how it is, and not bother with it. But you look back at World War One, and that's exactly what caused the Soviet Revolution
Yeah.
was getting involved in a war where they were like, hey, wait a minute, why are we sending people to die when we've got all these other problems going on? And it's compounded by now it's the war causing those problems. And
Yeah.
then Putin saying, well, it's a defensive war, and we're getting these, and I'm just going off of Russian propaganda to say that, well, the Ukrainians are all, fascist Nazis, and we're going to stop them to get, from getting into Russia. Except, oh wait, now 2 years into the war, now they're in Russia. Um, so how's that going?
Yeah. And I when you talk about that, there's like an interesting comment in one of the Russia social media posts that I've been looking at. One of them even says like someone is really shocked that the Ukrainians are just walking the streets and not stealing anything. Okay, not okay, they invaded, not steal. That's unimaginable to him. I mean, it's so interesting, like the difference on attitude between both peoples, but that also, I think they were really ordered not to do anything stupid. So they keep the moral high ground, which they kind of need for the international opinion.
Right.
Um, and I think like the unless you want to add anything else, I think we can move to another topic.
Yeah, no, I think we pretty much covered it. Like right now, we're just kind of in the midpoint to see where does this go from here.
Yeah,
Um, I'm curious to see. I mean, it's going to go badly for Russia. We've already seen, now they've been forced onto the defensive, and so they're going to have to abandon a lot of their offensive campaigns. And if they try to continue them, I mean, they're just going to be pincer moved. Like I anticipate Ukraine is doing this to be able to be like, well, now that we can divert you over there, now we can work our way south again and cut you all off. And then it's just a
maybe
matter of outwaiting.
they have
Um,
been recapturing some of the villages that the Russians took in the Donbass last 2 weeks, which is already an interesting development.
right? And I feel like
Uh,
maybe that's kind of what we didn't see behind the scenes is just this build up that Ukraine has had to be like, we're just biding our time and hoping that things don't get worse until we can absolutely sucker punch Russia.
yeah, and when you look at especially in Kursk itself, you see a lot of equipment that I myself wasn't aware it was already there. So, I mean, if someone in NATO, especially, was able to send stuff without alerting social media and newspapers and whatever, that was a good work. And sometimes I even feel that some of the information that was given, because for example, the F-16s, like they were inducted like 1 or 2 weeks ago, but they were already there like at least a month ago. So I sometimes I ask myself how much of the troubles Ukraine has been having in receiving this equipment is just sand in the eyes, and it's they are received because it happened like 2 months ago when I just made I went to see to try to check and assess how much equipment Ukraine has already received. And I was like, I look at the numbers and it was like I think it was 500 Bradleys and like 1,000 M113s. I'm like, this is more than I remember.
Yeah. No, I think they've been chugging some stuff out, and that's like that aid packages, or those aid packages rather, that they were talking about is, when they say they're sending $1 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, that doesn't tell you exactly what they're sending.
Mhm.
And I mean, in $1 billion, how many M113s and Bradleys can you stuff into that, and trucks
Exactly.
and missiles?
And then you have countries like Norway and Finland who openly don't say what they're sending. We send stuff, figure it out.
Yep. Well, and I think it's because a lot of Europe, especially, is wiser to the situation than the United States, in the sense
Yeah,
that, again, we have an ocean between us. And so I think from the American perspective, a lot of Americans are like, well, that's over there. That's not an us problem. Um, but when you live somewhere like Germany or Poland, especially, it's like if this goes badly, what happens next? They're not going
yeah,
to stop at just Ukraine because they went entirely from 2014. Well, we took over the Crimea, but we're not interested in Ukraine. We're not going to bother Ukraine. It's fine. We don't want to do that. And then they invaded it. It's like, well, you can't even
yeah,
trust what they're saying, though. It's like I said before that the sneaky thing about Putin and his regime is during the Soviet era, we knew Russian, diplomatic strategy was, well, if I tell you I have one submarine in that area, they're going to have two. But
yeah,
with Putin's regime, it's we don't have any submarines in there and they have 10. So
yeah,
very
yeah.
different.
And the Poles already said that if, for example, Belarus enters the war, they will deal with that situation.
Well, in the polls, I think the Russians don't count on aren't the Polish that they remember
Yeah,
that they don't want to be in a war, but if you drag them into one, I guarantee they will bring the fight. Like
they
they're
will. They've been itching for it since the start.
oh yeah, they've been chomping at the bit, going, "Oh man, if you cross this border, dude, we are coming after you."
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, and going ahead, like, which the next disaster you want to talk about, like Palestine or the American elections?
uh, I think honestly the American elections might be more interesting because I would just say something brief on the Palestinian war is I think this is something that we've kind of seen coming for a while
Yeah,
with Netanyahu. I think there's a disconnect with a lot of people in the world where they just kind of see, Israel as, for America in particular, I can speak to that. A lot of Americans kind of see Israel as, of course, the victimized country. They got their independence and they fought for it and they have it. And so it's like, well, that's why they're allies and we have to defend them. What they don't realize is Netanyahu is another one of this next generation of, wannabe dictators. I mean, he
yeah,
might very well be a dictator now because look at what he gets away with. Um,
yeah.
and then
Even
it's
though
like,
the population hates him.
exactly, and that's why I'll openly call Netanyahu a dictator because I mean his own people are like, we don't like this guy. Like, look what he's dragging us into, and yet he still does it. So there's
Yeah,
obviously no oversight there.
I do
Uh,
remember the mass rallies last year before the strike in October. Like, people really want to get rid of him. I think they still do want to get rid of him. But then there's like the codependency relationship between Netanyahu and Hamas, where they know they need each other. Because if peace broke out, they'll both be out of jobs.
yeah, essentially. Well, and it's such a mess anyway because the history of Israel is so just messy to begin with. Like, it was British controlled Palestine, and then after World War II, they were like, well, what do we do with all of these, Jewish people? Well, we can give them their own place. Here, have a section of
Mhm.
Palestine.
Yeah,
And, since it was British rule, there's, of course, the argument that it's like, well, they were given that land, which, of course, the Palestinians, of course, were like, hey, so we were here first.
yeah,
But, then it's also like you go back into like tribal, claims to land and stuff. But this goes back thousands of years. Like, I don't think
it,
21st century it's quite as relevant now as, it would have been 1,000 years ago.
it
Um,
isn't. Like, and one of the things that, because you say in America, people usually support Israel. In
right.
my experience with Europeans, that we are r- we, but I'm not myself, but rapidly pro-Palestine. I even saw like people supporting Hamas itself, which to me is like supporting Hamas to support Palestine. To me, is like supporting the Jews in the World War II, but being pro-Gestapo.
Yeah, it's like, wait a minute. Well, and I think people need to make that distinction too, that, the people, again, like I support Russians. I've
Yeah,
loved Russian culture. I've loved Russian people pretty much all my life. Like, I think they're amazing people. I have an adopted Russian mom, and she's the most amazing person ever. But then again, it's like I that doesn't mean I can abide by Putin in that. And same thing with Netanyahu for Israel or Hamas for the Palestinians is they're separate entities.
yeah.
Hamas is
Never forget that Hamas took power of the Gaza Strip through force. They expelled the Palestinian Authority from there.
yeah, well, and that's important to remember too, that these people are not, there to be like pro-Palestinian. They're
Mhm.
pro-Hamas.
Actually,
Um,
sorry for interrupting you, but I know a historian. It's a Portuguese historian. Who usually talks about military stuff, Portuguese military history. And when I talked to him about this, one of the things that he told me is that Hamas doesn't have 200 hostages. They have 2 million hostages, and that makes a sad amount of sense.
It really does, because I mean that's the disconnect I think people have too. Is Hamas is not Palestine or the Palestinians as much as the Palestinians are not Hamas. It's like if you look at Ireland during the Troubles, the IRA
Mhm.
is not Ireland.
Exactly.
Uh, as much as like it could be fractured, between North and Southern Ireland, and Protestant and Catholic. Uh, you know, to say the IRA is Ireland wouldn't make any sense. They're, a group in Ireland. They're fighting for Irish independence in their own way, and everything else, but they are not the Irish people, as much as they might be fighting for them or fighting for their own interests, is up for debate. But at the same time, in Palestine, if I walk into a shop and talk to a guy in the shop, that doesn't mean that he's going to automatically be, a Muslim terrorist, for example. It's just he's a
Yeah.
Palestinian guy. Like, honestly, before all this kicked off, I could probably go there and get a cup of coffee, like a really good cup of coffee from a Palestinian guy. There would be no problem. Same thing. I could go into Israel and get, things from that. But it's really sad that one group of people can drag down everybody else with them. Looking at comparing that to America, like the thing that made me kind of groan and shake my head was, you know, the fact that the United States elected Donald Trump somehow,
Hmm.
I think made the rest of the world kind of look at us sideways and go, "What the hell? Like, what is wrong with
Yeah.
America?" But there's so many of us here, like maybe even the majority, that are so unhappy with him and not for him. Uh, but again, if I went to Europe and said I'm an American while Trump was president, their automatic assumption is going to be, wow, and you support that guy? And it's like, no, not at
Yeah.
all. But you don't know that because I came from that place. Uh,
Yeah.
but it's just a mess. And then the region itself has been, replete with wars and strife between people, since they were tribes. Like, and that happens all over the world, but it's especially volatile there. As kind of a segue, something interesting I learned for American history is, like for Native Americans, they've suffered the most in the United States as far as, people taking their land and taking things away. But what was interesting to me that stood out, that really kind of shows, number one, racism's stupid because human beings all over the planet are the same. Like, you really
Yeah.
can't say we're any different. We're all the same. It's just the damn truth.
It
Because
is.
there was a major tribe here in Montana that had done trade with Europeans and acquired firearms. Um, and because they had acquired firearms, they then conquered all the tribes around them, because now they had superior weapon, technology. They had this means to then steamroll everybody
Yeah.
around them, and it's like this is just a cycle that just happens with people. I feel like, somebody
It
gets an
is.
advantage. What we
It's
need.
like the history of African slavery too. Like when the Europeans start selling firearms to the tribes that capture the slaves, they kind of destroyed civilization in Africa. Those tribes with the firearms.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the other thing too. Like, here in America, it's brought up a lot about, like slavery and the repercussions from that, but that's just for the American experience. And I think they're missing the point that in Africa, it's so much worse. You can see where that exact culture has transferred into modern times, where,
Yeah.
I mean, you have some countries I would feel totally safe going to in Africa, and I would think that, I would have an amazing time exploring them. Places like
Hmm.
Kenya, or even places like Morocco. But then other ones like Sudan, the Congo, you'll have random groups of armed people, even when they work for the police, that'll just block roads. And if you even smell like a tourist, they're like, "Hey, so you're paying to use this road now, or bad things are going to happen to you." And
Yeah.
it's like that whole culture has just been pervasive since then. And then like you pointed out, that happened back then. Is they would then conquer another tribe and then turn around to the Europeans and go, "Hey, we have prisoners that we don't really care about. You want to buy them?" Um,
Exactly.
so it's
Like it is for the Arabs before that.
exactly, and so I think what we need to do as a species, if I just get on my soapbox and say something, is we need to stop pointing fingers and going, well, you're responsible for the problem. There is a problem, but how do we move past this? With Israel and Palestine, there was a really cool documentary where there were musicians that were working together from Israel and Palestine, and they were talking about, well, we love music, and we were able to set aside everything else to go, hey, look, we're just people.
Mhm.
We need to look past all the tribal crap and all the political stuff and, not worry about that and just go, well, these are people. I had a Palestinian classmate going through college actually before Trump got elected, and I was asking her if she was worried about that, and she said not really, because there's America is a democracy, and we'll work things out if things go bad. And I was like, she has more faith in our system than I do. But at the same time, sweetest person ever. Like, I had a bias against, and I'll fully admit that, against a lot of Islamic culture. I figured, well, it's very much if you're a woman, you never talk to a man. There's never going to be that sort of like just normal connection, people to people. But I talked to her. I shared coffee with her. She brought food to the class at one point. She made us like this flatbread. She called it like a Palestinian pizza, basically, because she couldn't describe it any other way. But it was super good, and she was able to share
Mhm.
that, and it blew my mind that this woman from Palestine, this mom, could then just share this stuff with me, and I was like, that points out, like, if we really tried, I could go anywhere in the world, just about any country, maybe not Somalia, but just about anywhere else, and find a random person and say, hey, what would be a good thing to eat here? Could you recommend something? And more often than not, people would be very receptive to that and very helpful. And I think that's what we need to get back to, is instead of worrying about, well, you wear this color shirt, or you're this religion, or you support this politician, or, you're this nationality, we really need to start breaking down those borders just to integrate more. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, it does. It does, and it goes with everything that you've been saying, like about human, and we should wise up regarding that. Um, with that said, you did talk about Trump, and I really want to know what are your thoughts regarding the incoming elections. I kind of made a video a few weeks ago where I assumed that changing to Kamala Harris will just be a shot in the feet for the Democrats. But things have changed quite a lot since I said that, and I was wrong, I think.
oh, well, and it's interesting because with Kamala Harris, I wasn't very sure about her when Biden picked her as vice president. Um, and I think there was a lot of hesitancy with a lot of my countrymen, kind of like, well, not a lot was known about her, at least the layman. But then as far as rule of law and order, she was a prosecutor, for a
Yeah,
long time, and that I think bodes really well, at least for me. I'm like, well, I know she's going to uphold the law as
yeah.
opposed to her opponent. Um, but then also her vice president pick. I can't remember his name right off the top of my head, but the governor of Minnesota. He's that
Mhm.
24-year veteran. He put out videos too, about just going to the fair with his daughter and, doing just normal Minnesota things. And
Team
I feel
wall,
like, yeah.
team walls.
And, being a rural guy too, more like
Mhm.
Minnesota, more moderate, not necessarily conservative, but moderate for sure.
Mhm.
Um, but then it's one of those things that, like, all the demographic, like I was talking about earlier, the only thing I started to really kind of dislike about the left And that's coming from the left. Like, not to like shame them and say they've always, been whatever, but I was a Democrat for a long time, a registered Democrat. I went and supported the LGBT community, just all sorts of stuff. But then I started to feel kind of attacked after a while that, there's this whole movement that's like, well, if you're a white guy, your time is over and you've had too much, privilege and yada yada. And I was like, I grew up at one point without hot running water. I don't
Yeah,
understand what your point is that I suddenly have this magical life you think I had. And that is beyond alienating. Like, it turns me more into like, I don't know if I want to be supportive of your team now, and it's not all of
yeah,
them. It would be unfair to say that everybody on the left thinks that way, but it's just those messages and nobody standing up to that and saying, hey, wait a minute, we can't blame every guy just because they're, white and male or whatever, because that's essentially, like racism too. You can't lump everybody into one category. Um, and I think that's the trap that a lot of men in our country are running into. My friend mentioned that earlier, is that, the MAGA movement is kind of like, well, they're all against you guys. Come over to us and, we're your team. And it has that appeal, I think, to a lot of people where they feel, that they're not going to lose their station in life. They're not going to lose their jobs. 'Cause, I mean, even little subtle things, like I don't know if Europe touches on it at all, but in the United States, there's this big feeling of like, um, the Me Too movement was really good. I feel like it brought a lot of things to light that had been invisible for a long time, but where it kind of delved into areas where it started to go a little too far is where now suddenly there's this disconnect where, just saying matter of factly, as a man, if I walk into my work and make a lewd comment, let's say, to a woman, I could get fired for that. I could go to HR. I could get a complaint. But if she does that to me, nothing happens.
yeah,
So it's one of those things. It's like, well, wait a minute. You need to be able to have at least some equal accountability for all this. And I think that's what's happening with the MAGA crowd, is then they're getting all these people that are scared of that. They're terrified. Like, I'm annoyed, I'm irritated, but I'm not terrified of it, because I'm like, well, this is just kind of how things go. It's a pendulum swing, and it's going to go the other way for a little while before it goes back to the middle. Um,
it's like most people are essentially emotional. Like you can, my experience tells you cannot expect most people to try to rationalize and search for facts to explain what is happening to them. They'll just react and use whatever knowledge they have at hand. And again, there's a guy like you said that he spent like a lot of time even without running water, and probably starved a few times in his life. And you tell him, "Oh, you're white. You have everything." You're like, "I suffer my entire life." Like, how will you react in that circumstances? Like, you will start to believe that the others don't want you to have anything. That all the suffering, that all the problems you have are meaningless, and you want to search for some meaning. So when someone says, "Oh, you are special. Come to me and I'll make you special." If you don't know any better, what are you supposed to do, right?
exactly. And I think that's what the MAGA crowd is kind of playing on, is it's not so much that people believe in their message or that they even really have a message, because honestly I don't think they even do at this point.
Yeah, I don't think
uh,
so.
it's just they want to be on this team that they feel like, they're a part of something that's going to represent what they want. And even if it's not like they will accomplish what they want, it's close enough that they'd be comfortable with it, and so they just kind of buy into it and throw their weight
Yeah,
behind it. And so it's a trap. It's definitely a trap. Arnold Schwarzenegger actually came out with a really, really good video. I don't know if you saw that, where he talked about how Nazi propaganda worked much the same way.
yeah.
Uh, where
When
he
they talk
was
about his loser Nazi father.
Exactly. Where he
Yeah,
was
yeah,
like, these people believed something and then they joined the wrong side, and when they lost, it's like all they had. And so he was just telling people, open your eyes. And I think that's the thing that's the problem now is it's not so much that people are evil or that they are malign as much as they just don't want to open their eyes. They just want to close their eyes, put their hands over their head, and scream until it's over. And
hmm
because of
yeah,
that, though, they're not looking around and smelling the burning bacon, essentially.
yeah. Um,
So, but it's wacky. We'll see how it goes. But I think with the vice president pick that Harris made, it'll bode a lot better because now it's kind of a sign to, even for like my points earlier where I was like, well, where is my representation? Well, there it is. This guy's a
exactly.
veteran and, he's reasonable and moderate. And so I think that'll get a lot of people from moving away from, having to just pick a side essentially.
Yeah,
And
because if Kamala like presents herself as a so-called leftist, but she now finds a moderate as her vice president. Suddenly, she's approaching a wider array of voters, potential voters, than if she's just banded on the leftist bandwagon, right? And in the
exactly.
meanwhile, uh, Trump has been imploding, as far as I can
Yeah.
tell. I
Well,
mean,
and his pick
can you
is all
explain that?
well, and his pick was hilarious too, because it's like here's a guy who compared him to being America's Hitler, and then he picks him to be his vice president, and now he's on the bandwagon with him. It's like, dude, this guy's an opportunist. Like, you can't even
Yeah,
put it any other way. Like, are you serious right now? Like, uh,
maybe just said some nice words to Trump. He was like, "Oh, I want you now," because it's the only thing that makes sense in my mind.
right? And I
Because
just think as
yeah,
an American, as somebody who's been watching this the whole way along and just kind of keeping up with it, I think they're just losing their minds at this point. Just to be
yeah.
totally honest, they're
I mean,
grasping at straws.
we talked about this before we start recording, but um, like Trump for the last 1 or 2 weeks, like two incredible things that happened the same week, right? Like sometimes the world doesn't move for 10 years, and it moves 10 years in 1 week. Um, like there was the Ukrainian offensive, of course, and now Trump. Like I'm looking at his most recent interviews, and it doesn't seem like the same guy. He look really aged. I mean, it's
Yeah,
kind
well,
of it's kind of scaring me regarding his health for starters.
yeah, he's definitely going downhill. Like if you compare pictures between like 2016 and now, like he's definitely definitely having health problems.
I'm not saying that far, like 2023 and now. That's enough to see that something is not right.
Yeah, well, and like I said, I feel like there's the cognitive decline. But with my mom, where she went downhill, and she's essentially Trump's age. He's only a year older than she was.
Mhm.
Um, and when she went downhill, her kidneys started to fail, and she had all of these like cognitive issues where she wouldn't be able to like keep track of things in reality, or she would hyperfixate on something that didn't mean anything at all. Or she would want something that was impossible, but it wasn't reasonable for her to comprehend that she couldn't do that or couldn't have that. Like,
Yeah,
she lost her ability to walk at one point, and she would still try to get out of bed. To the point where I had to tell her, "You cannot walk. You have to ask me for help." And she'd still try and end up like on the floor. So I had to get her one of the special hospital beds with the rails to be like, you cannot get out of bed. Like there's
yeah,
this disconnect for you that you don't understand. Um, but I see that very much happening in him now too. Like you can kind of see whenever he goes off um, script, He
Hmm.
doesn't have any point A to point B to point C thought process. It's like, he'll go from A to B to 17, and it's like, wait, what?
Yeah, it just rambles aimlessly. And and I mean, what will make sense will be for I mean, from my perspectives, will be for the Republicans to do the same that the Democrats did. That we need another candidate. But then there's the MAGA mad, mad people that just clenching to the party. And as I told you, like, I think it's really sad that the party with the history of the Republican Party is being destroyed from the inside out by the bunch of mad people.
Yeah, and it really is because they are not the party of Eisenhower like anymore.
Yeah.
Eisenhower was a good leader. He got a lot done, and on his way out, like Eisenhower went out of his way. He wasn't a fan of Kennedy. He campaigned very hard against Kennedy, but as soon as the campaign ended and he handed over the presidency, he made a point to go out and say, I have full confidence that he will uphold, our laws for the United States, and I want, our Congress and our party to work with him as, I worked with his party in the last few years of my own term. And,
Hmm.
even like further, he warned about the military industrial complex and all these other
Yeah.
things. Like Eisenhower was a cool dude. He was one of the best presidents we ever had, a general from World War II. Um, but we don't see that anymore. Like they've totally lost any of that. And now I would say at this point where we are in the United States, it's almost worse than it was in the 1800s. Like when you had like
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson and like people beating each other with sticks in Congress. I mean, you look at some of the political leaders like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I guarantee like three-quarters of America become nauseous when she speaks. So it's just remarkable that these people are in power.
Yeah. It is. And I mean, if Kamala Harris does win the elections, maybe that will be a wake up for the Republican Party to try to find itself again. As I told you, like, I think what will make more sense will be for the MAGA crowd just jump wagon and make their own party and rot in the corner as it is, or and allow the Republicans to find their place once more. Because, I mean, if the Republican Party is destroyed, what will be of the United States with just one viable party? Like, they will break the country by themselves or by allowing the other guys to rule alone. And I think that when you get to a point where you just have two parties, because I live in a country that has like a bunch of them, and like most European countries, like in the last decades, um, it has been impossible to make a government with just one party. They always need to ally with some close close groups to really manage to form a government. But that gives a plurality that, despite all the internal issues, allows for actual discussion of some of those social issues the country has. While in the United States, you are reduced to two parties. You have a lot more parties, I know that, but they are really minimal, really vestigial.
Yeah, they don't
And
matter.
if the Republicans can destroy themselves, it will plunge the country in a real crisis of identity, because not everyone identifies with the Democrats.
Right. Well, and that's where some things have been fascinating too. Like there might be a resurgence to take back the Republican Party to like traditional values because
Mhm.
there's the Lincoln Project. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I've heard
Where
about that, but I don't know details.
Yeah, essentially it's Republicans that were like, we don't like that they've robbed the Republican Party of what it meant to be. And so they've been very active. Like they're not a very loud voice, but they've been active in saying this is not okay. Like this is not
Mm.
who the Republican Party is. We're not the party of Trump. We were supposed to be the party of, Grant and Eisenhower and things like that. And even looking back at recent history, you look at presidents like Nixon, and Nixon was not nearly as bad. Like Nixon was a good president in comparison to
Yeah,
Trump, so that's saying something. Um,
yeah.
But I also feel like ever since Reagan, there was this like sort of downturn in the Republican Party where, yeah, I think their first mistake was electing an actor to be a president. It's like
Mhm.
no other experience, and that kind of opened the door to the problems they're having now.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, the Ukrainians who have an actor as a president and is doing a fine job.
well, yeah, but Zelensky's a badass, so
Yeah,
there's a difference there. I don't see Reagan saying, instead of sending me home, just send me ammunition. Um,
exactly.
but no, there's so many different things. There's also a movement now, Republicans for Harris, that they
Mhm.
started up, where these
Yes,
people are
I saw
like,
that.
yeah, where they were so disenfranchised, I think, from just seeing MAGA take over the Republican Party, that they were like, we're just going to vote the other way because we don't like that you've ruined our party.
Yeah,
Um, and I think
I
that's
mean,
amazing.
there are one of, despite my fears, one of the things that I understand regarding the current movements, like the one you talk about, is that there are Republicans that are actually betting on the Democrat victory in the elections to really force the Republicans to purge themselves and go back to what they were.
Right. And it'll take that because I don't think short of that anybody will have any confidence in them anymore.
Yeah,
Internationally even, like I'm pretty sure now, not even just talking to you, but if I walked up to somebody randomly, let's say in Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, and I asked them, who would you feel more comfortable being in charge of the United States, a Democrat or Republican? Even knowing nothing of the political system, I'm pretty sure I know what the answer would be.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
um,
I really, I know some people that like Trump, but they are really a minority, and they are not. Most of them are not really what I would call like accepting people. If I,
no. Well, and I think the disconnect too is, if they met these people, they would have an entirely different perspective of who they are.
yeah,
Um, like Trump is the kind of guy where I can see where some people who know nothing about him at all, like if you started from square zero, you never knew anything about the guy, where they might be like, oh, well, it's kind of cool. He just speaks his mind. I could support that. That's cool. But then if they went somewhere with him, he'd be exactly the kind of rich guy who'd show up in like a Ferrari and then, sit there and be like, so now that we had this really expensive dinner, you're covering that. And be like,
yeah,
wait, but you're the rich asshole. Why aren't you paying for it? So,
exactly. Uh,
but,
and
that's just how it is.
I mean, I think we covered like the three main topics. We've been talking for almost 2 hours. I think we
Yeah,
can call it
wrap it
here.
up. Yeah, we
Yeah,
could
wrap
wrap
it
it
up.
up. So many good things to talk about, and it's been too long. I mean, it was just so much to catch up on.
Indeed, and I mean, we have a lot of other stuff I would like to talk about and to know your opinions about, like the situation in Myanmar, where the government is really on the back foot, and maybe the civil war may be entering its final stages. You have Sudan, which also suffering a terrible civil war. The situation in Azerbaijan is not resolved yet, and
And
it is interesting to understand what is happening to the Soviet sphere, like so many interesting things to talk about, even the boiling civil war in Venezuela. And I
yeah,
think we should really talk about those topics in the next weeks. I'll be up to another of these conversations later on.
yeah, and then maybe even like we could break them up into shorter chunks for folks, so it's not a
Oh,
2 hour
yeah,
long thing. But I know I've always been happy to listen to podcasts and just while I'm working on the truck or something, it gives me something to listen to. It's not gonna shut off in 30 minutes like a music playlist on YouTube. So
exactly. And with that bombshell and a good advice of what to do with our conversations, I think we'll be off. See all of
excellent.
you guys later.
Thank you for having me again.
Always a pleasure.